Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, glad of your company for another quiet reckoning. Tell me, when did you last read an old page by lamplight, ink faded soft with years? Some pages, Watson believed, hold truths gentler than any spoken word if one has patience to look closely. Do subscribe so no entry goes unread. Now, turn the page with me, for as Holmes held, it is the small overlooked marks that speak plainest. Find us always on the Watson's Margins Spotify channel, link waiting below. Chapter 1. The Stillness of Belminster. There are certain villages in England which seem to have made a private treaty with time, exempting themselves from its usual disorder. Belminster in the county of Surrey was such a place. I had occasion to visit it in the early autumn of the year, and I recall thinking, as our train drew into the small stone station, that here at last was a corner of the world in which nothing violent could ever occur. The cottages stood in a neat crescent about the green, their gardens trimmed with a precision that spoke of long habit rather than recent effort, and the clock upon the church tower, I was informed with evident local pride, had not lost more than a minute in any month for as long as living memory could recall. It is a curious thing, looking back, how often such places of apparent perfect order conceal the deepest disturbances of the human heart. Holmes remarked upon it himself before we had even left the platform. "You are admiring the tranquillity, Watson," said he, drawing his coat about him against the mild chill of the morning. "I confess I find it faintly ominous. A village that polices its hedgerows so severely is generally hiding something beneath them." I laughed at this, taking it for one of his customary flights of cynicism, but I was to remember the remark before the day was out. We had come to Belminster at the written request of the Reverend Septimus Vale, rector of St. Anselm's, whose letter had reached Baker Street 2 mornings before. It was a curious document, courteous to the point of apology, and yet unmistakably troubled beneath its politeness. The Reverend wrote that a matter had arisen touching the parish register, which he dared not entrust to the post in greater detail, and begged that Holmes would do him the great kindness of a personal visit. Holmes, who received on average a dozen such appeals in a week, and answered scarcely 1 in 10, had read this letter twice, and set it aside with the observation that a country clergyman does not trouble a London specialist over a mere clerical error. "There is guilt in that letter, Watson," he said, tapping the page, "though whose guilt and of what nature I cannot yet say. Notice how he underlines the word 'carefully' in describing the alteration, and how he refers 3 times to the honour of the parish, before once mentioning the truth of the matter. A man who values appearances above facts is a man already half persuaded that the facts will not be kind to him. The rectory of St. Anselm's proved a low, comfortable house of grey stone, ivied along its southern wall, standing in the shadow of the church itself. The Reverend Vale received us in his study, a small book-lined room smelling pleasantly of pipe tobacco and old paper. He was a spare, elderly man with a gentle, deeply lined face, and the particular stoop of the shoulders that comes from a lifetime spent bending over desks and altars. His hands, I noticed, trembled slightly as he poured our tea, though whether from age or agitation I could not then have said. "You're very good to come, Mr. Holmes," said he, "and I hardly know how to begin, save to say that I have discovered something in our parish register which I cannot explain, and which I fear may do a grave injustice to persons I hold in the highest regard." He led us across the churchyard beneath a lich gate green with moss, and into the vestry of St. Anselm's, a narrow chamber smelling of wax and old wood, where a great oaken cupboard stood bolted to the wall. From this he drew, with the reverence of a man handling a relic, a heavy leather-bound volume, its pages yellowed, and its ink faded to the soft brown of autumn leaves. "The marriage register," he explained, "kept in this cupboard, under lock, for very nearly 200 years. I was preparing an entry for a forthcoming wedding when I chanced upon this." He opened the book to a page dated the 14th of June, 1872, and set it before Holmes upon the desk. I leaned over my friend's shoulder and saw at once what had disturbed the old clergyman. The entry recorded the marriage of one Agnes Bell to a bridegroom whose name, upon close inspection, did not sit easily upon the page. The ink, though aged in appearance, lay with a faint unevenness across the paper, and beneath it, visible only when the light fell aslant, one could discern the ghost of an earlier surface scraped thin. Holmes drew out his lens and bent low over the page for a full minute without speaking. "The name now standing is Jonathan Wycliffe," he said at last. "But another name stood here before it, and someone has taken considerable pains to remove all trace of it, and greater pains still to make the substitution appear as old as the page itself." He looked up. "This is not the work of an hour, Mr. Vale. This is the work of a patient and skilled hand, one that understood not only how to erase but how to age." "That is precisely what alarms me," said Vale. "For if the entry is false, then the marriage of Agnes Bell to Jonathan Wycliffe was never properly recorded, and the legitimacy of their children stands in doubt. Mrs. Wycliffe is now an invalid, Mr. Holmes, cared for these many years by her daughter Eleanor, who conducts our village school with the greatest devotion, and by her son Matthew, but lately appointed to a hospital post in London. I could not bear to think that some ancient fraud, however committed, might now fall upon such innocent heads." Holmes asked who possessed access to the register, and Vale enumerated a short list. Himself. Caleb Rudge, the parish clerk, a precise and dutiful man who had kept the books for 20 years. Mr. Lionel Harcourt, the land agent, who occasionally consulted parish records in the course of his genealogical inquiries. Sir Adrian Mercer, the local magistrate, and Eleanor Wycliffe herself, who brought her school children to study the old registers as a lesson in local history. "And each of these persons," Holmes inquired, "how did they receive the news of the discovery?" "With horror, sir, every one of them. All have offered their fullest cooperation." "That is interesting," said Holmes, though I could not at first see why. He fell silent, walking slowly about the narrow vestry, examining the cupboard, the lock, the worn stone flags underfoot. "You will observe, Watson," he said presently, "that our forger did not merely wish to alter the past. He wished the alteration to appear as though it had always belonged to it. That is a very particular kind of dishonesty, and a very particular kind of patience. A man in sudden need does not trouble to fade his ink to match 60 years of exposure to vestry light. He acts, and he flees. This was planned, and planned by someone unhurried." He had scarcely finished speaking when we heard footsteps upon the gravel path without, brisk and confident, and a moment later the vestry door opened to admit a tall, well-dressed man of perhaps 55, with iron-grey hair, a florid complexion, and the assured bearing of one long accustomed to being listened to. "Ah, Vale," said he, before he had so much as glanced at us. "I am told you have been troubling yourself over the old register. You need not have summoned assistance from town. I have this very morning come into possession of evidence which proves the entry perfectly genuine, and I am prepared to settle the whole matter privately, without the smallest disturbance to the parish." He turned to us then, and I saw a swift, appraising look pass across his features as Vale made the introductions. Mr. Lionel Harcourt, land agent of Belminster Lodge. "Mr. Holmes," said he, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, "I fear you have had a wasted journey. There is nothing here that need concern a man of your talents." Holmes regarded him for a moment with that particular stillness which I had learned, over years of friendship, to recognise as the deepest form of his attention. "You're very confident, Mr. Harcourt," said he mildly, "for a man who has not yet told us what your evidence is." Something flickered behind Harcourt's easy smile, gone in an instant, but not, I think, unseen by Holmes. I confess that I too felt an obscure distrust of the man's smoothness, as one distrusts a road too well swept to show the tracks of those who have lately travelled it. Holmes said nothing further upon the subject, but as we took our leave of the rectory that afternoon, I observed that he glanced back once at Belminster Lodge, visible above its screen of elms, with an expression I can only describe as that of a hound that has caught, faint but unmistakable, the first thread of a scent. Chapter 2. A Man of Useful Knowledge. Belminster Lodge stood a little apart from the village proper, behind a screen of elms that gave it, even at midday, a certain wintry aspect out of keeping with the season. It was a severe Georgian house of grey brick, its windows tall and narrow, and I remember thinking, as we approached along the gravel drive, that a man's dwelling will often confess what his conversation conceals. There was nothing here of the comfortable disorder one finds in most country houses, no dog asleep upon the step, no children's hoops abandoned upon the lawn, only a raked gravel walk and a brass knocker polished to an almost accusing brightness. We were admitted by a manservant into a study that occupied the greater part of the ground floor, and here I confess my first impression of Mr. Lionel Harcourt underwent a certain revision. The room was lined from floor to ceiling with document boxes, each neatly labelled in a small, precise hand. Family trees, some of considerable age, hung framed upon the walls, and upon a long table lay copied certificates, sealed letters, and legal abstracts arranged with the scrupulous order of a man who trusted nothing to memory that could instead be filed. "You find me at my life's work, gentlemen," said Harcourt, rising from behind the table with every appearance of cordiality. 30 years I have given to the tracing of disputed inheritances, the verification of family claims, the setting right of old confusions. It is not a glamorous calling, Mr. Holmes, but I flatter myself it is a useful one." "A defender of truth," Holmes observed, seating himself without invitation in the chair nearest the window. "You put it kindly. I should say, rather a defender of certainty. The two are not always the same thing, but they generally travel together." Harcourt smiled again, that same smile which failed to warm the eyes above it, and offered us sherry, which Holmes declined, and I, from a certain wariness I could not have explained, declined also. It was in the conversation that followed that I began to understand why Belminster spoke of its land agent, as I had already noticed it did, with a caution quite unlike the plain gratitude one might expect toward a benefactor. Harcourt spoke freely, almost boastfully, of the families he had assisted, of heirs restored to fortunes, of frauds detected, of ancient wrongs set right by patient research among parish books and county records. Yet as he spoke, Holmes asked certain quiet questions, seemingly idle, about the terms upon which such assistance had been rendered, and I noticed that Harcourt's answers, though never quite dishonest, grew steadily more evasive. It emerged, by degrees, that more than one grateful heir had found it convenient, after Harcourt's intervention, to sell land to him at a price a shade below its worth, that more than one public figure had paid, under the decent name of a consultation fee, for Harcourt's continued silence upon some inconvenient fact of ancestry. "You're a man who has made himself indispensable," said Holmes at length, "by first making himself informed of things others would rather forget. I make no apology for knowledge, Mr. Holmes. The truth exists whether or not it is comfortable. And you have found," said Holmes, "that discomfort has a market value." Harcourt's composure did not break, but it tightened, as a rope tightens under strain without yet showing the fibre. "You are thinking of the Wycliffe matter," said he, "since you have come from the rectory. Very well, I will be plain with you, for I think you are a man who prefers plainness to pretence. I believe the marriage of Agnes Bell to Jonathan Wycliffe, recorded in our register in the year 1872, was no true marriage at all. I have reason to believe Agnes Bell was married before, under another name, to a man then living, and that her later union with Wycliffe was therefore an act of bigamy, however innocently entered into. The altered entry in the register, I am persuaded, was created to conceal this fact. I own that I felt a chill at this pronouncement, thinking of the gentle invalid Mrs. Wycliffe I had not yet met, and of her children whose whole future stood, upon this man's word, in sudden jeopardy. Holmes, however, showed no such feeling, but asked only, in a voice of perfect composure, to see the documents upon which so grave an assertion rested. Here Harcourt hesitated for the first time. "I should prefer," said he, "to settle the matter privately with the family before making my evidence more widely known. Miss Wycliffe possesses a small property, left her by her father, of no very great value in itself, but conveniently situated with respect to my own holdings. Should she consent to transfer it to me, I see no reason why the old unhappiness need ever come to public notice at all." "You call this a business arrangement," said Holmes. "I do. I have no wish to injure anyone, Mr. Holmes. I am a man of business, not a man of malice. I could contain myself no longer." "You call it business to hold a family's honour to ransom?" Harcourt regarded me with the mild, faintly wounded look of a man unjustly accused of poor manners. "You are a soldier, Doctor, and soldiers deal in simpler transactions than mine. I assure you I have never yet demanded a shilling that was not in some sense owed." We learned, before we took our leave, of others who might have cause to fear this useful, dangerous knowledge of Harcourt's. Sir Adrian Mercer, it seemed, had reason to dread some irregularity in the transfer by which his late father had come into the greater part of his estate. Mrs. Clara Bellamy, Harcourt's own secretary, a quiet, watchful widow who had served him, I gathered, through years of small humiliations, moved about the study with the resigned efficiency of long habit, and I saw her wince almost imperceptibly at some remark of her employer's regarding her usefulness. Even Reverend Vale, it appeared, had gone so far as to plead with Harcourt, urging him to suppress the Wycliffe evidence for the sake of an innocent family's peace, a plea which Harcourt had answered, so the Reverend later confided to me, with the observation that a clergyman ought to prefer truth to comfort, whatever the cost to his parishioners. As we rose to leave, I observed Holmes pause beside the writing table, his eye resting for a moment upon a small stick of dark green sealing wax lying near a stack of correspondence. Harcourt, sealing a letter for the afternoon post, pressed the wax to the paper, then pressed it a second time, firmly along its lower edge. "Your seal is chipped, Mr. Harcourt," Holmes remarked. "An old injury to the die," said Harcourt carelessly. "I have long meant to have it recut, and have never found the time." Holmes said nothing more, but I knew that look of quiet private satisfaction too well to mistake its meaning. He had marked the thing, and would not soon forget it. We returned to our lodging at the village inn as the afternoon light was failing, and had scarcely settled before the fire when a note was brought up, addressed to Holmes in a hand I now recognised as Harcourt's own. Holmes read it, and passed it to me without comment. It requested, in terms both urgent and secretive, that Holmes meet its author alone in the vestry of St. Anselm's at 9 o'clock that evening, promising to reveal at last the name of the person who had falsified the register. "He means to bargain further," I said. "Perhaps," said Holmes, folding the note and setting it upon the mantel. "Or perhaps, Watson, he means something else entirely. A man who trades in other men's secrets for 30 years accumulates, in the end, rather more enemies than friends. I confess I do not much like the smell of this appointment. We will go together, whatever he may have written, and we will go a little before the hour." Chapter 3. Death in the Vestry. The rain had begun a little before 8:30, a fine, persistent Surrey rain that darkened the churchyard yews and set the gravel path gleaming beneath our lantern as we made our way towards St. Anselm's. Holmes walked in silence, his collar turned up against the wet, and I did not disturb his thoughts, for I had learned long since that such silences generally preceded some sharpening of his faculties, rather than any relaxation of them. We reached the church a few minutes short of 9, and found, to my mild surprise, that the great door stood unlocked and slightly ajar. "Harcourt is early, or careless," I said. "Or neither," said Holmes, and pushed the door wide. The nave lay in darkness save for a thin line of light beneath the vestry door at its farther end. We crossed the stone flags, our footsteps unnaturally loud in that hollow silence, and Holmes rapped once, twice, upon the vestry door, and receiving no answer, opened it. I have seen death in many forms during my years of army service, and I had thought myself proof against its power to shock. Yet I own that the sight which met us in that narrow chamber struck me with a coldness I did not immediately shake off. Lionel Harcourt lay upon his back beside the open register cupboard, one arm flung wide, his head resting in a dark stain that had already begun to dull upon the stone flags. The brass processional cross, which I had seen not 2 days before standing in its accustomed place beside the altar, lay near his outflung hand, its heavy foot dulled with what I did not need my medical training to identify. Holmes was beside the body in an instant, his fingers at the throat, though a single glance at the stillness of that florid face had already told us both what we should find. "Dead these 20 minutes, I should say, perhaps a little more," he said quietly, and rose to his examination of the room with a swiftness that never in my experience of him gave way to haste. The register itself lay open upon the desk, at the very page the Reverend Vale had shown us that morning. Beside it, clenched within Harcourt's stiffening right hand, was a torn scrap of paper, and Holmes drew it gently from the dead fingers and held it to the lamp. Upon it, in Harcourt's own hand, were written the words, "Eleanor knows the truth." I felt my heart sink at the reading of it, for I had that afternoon formed, from the Reverend's account, a picture of Eleanor Wycliffe as a woman of unusual composure and devotion, and I could not easily reconcile such a character with the scene before us. Yet evidence, as Holmes has often reminded me, cares nothing for our preferences. The window at the farther end of the vestry stood open to the rain, and beneath it, upon the flagged floor, lay a small quantity of dark, damp earth, tracked, it seemed, by some hurried foot. Near this earth, half hidden in the shadow of the cupboard, I noticed a small object which, upon examination, proved to be a button, black, of good quality, plainly torn by force from the garment that had borne it. We had scarcely completed our survey when hurried steps sounded in the nave, and Inspector Lestrade, summoned, as I later learned, by the alarmed sexton, entered with 2 constables at his heels. He took in the scene with the quick, practical eye I had come to associate with him, and it was not 5 minutes before Eleanor Wycliffe herself, white-faced and trembling, was brought before us, having been found by ill fortune still lingering near the churchyard gate. She was a young woman of perhaps 25, dark-haired, with a countenance that even in its present distress retained a certain grave composure, and I confess that my sympathies were with her from the first moment I saw her master her fear sufficiently to speak. "That is my cloak," she said, when the button was shown to her, her voice low but steady. "I do not deny it. I was here this evening before 8 to plead with Mr. Harcourt on behalf of my brother's future. He refused to hear reason, and I left him alive, sir. I swear it, though in great anger, both his and mine." Lestrade's face had taken on the settled look of a man who believes his case already made. "Harcourt threatened your family, Miss Wycliffe. You came to him in desperation. There was a struggle, and in your anger you struck him and fled, and in your haste tore your cloak upon the cupboard there. The note in his hand names you." "I didn't kill him," she said, with a quiet firmness that impressed me more than any protestation of tears could have done. "I left him living. I have said so, and I shall say it again as often as I am asked." Holmes, who had listened to this exchange without interruption, now knelt once more beside the body, and I watched him examine with his lens first the dust upon the window ledge, then the position of Harcourt's spectacles, which had been flung some little distance from the face, then the brass cross itself, turning it gently in the lamplight. He paused longest over a small, irregular scratch upon the surface of the desk, in which lay a fine smear of dark green wax, and bent low to smell the dead man's right glove, still upon the hand, with an expression of some perplexity. "Lestrade," said he at length, "you will observe that this glove carries a distinct trace of lavender soap." "I observe it, Mr. Holmes, and I confess I do not see that it signifies. A man may use what soap he pleases." "He may," said Holmes, "save that this particular man, as I learned but this afternoon from more than one of his acquaintance, never removed that glove in cold weather on account of an old injury to the hand, and was never known to use scented soap of any kind. I expected, from long experience of his methods, that Holmes would now turn his close attention to the open window and the earth beneath it, which seemed to me, I confess, the most eloquent testimony in the room. Instead he rose, dusted his knees, and stood for a long moment gazing at that damp patch of soil, with an expression I can only describe as one of faint, private amusement, wholly out of keeping with the gravity of our surroundings. "The rain began at 20 minutes to 9, Lestrade," he said. "Watson will confirm it. We had barely reached the lich gate when the first drops fell, and yet this earth is damp only upon its surface, and dry as a biscuit but a quarter-inch beneath. Consider what that means before you close your notebook." Lestrade frowned, plainly unconvinced, but said nothing. "The intruder," Holmes added, turning to me with that particular light in his eye which I had learned to associate with the earlier stirrings of a solution, "has been so obliging as to bring us mud prepared expressly for our inspection. I confess I find the courtesy suspicious." Chapter 4. Several Excellent Motives. Morning brought no diminution of the trouble at Belminster, but rather a broadening of it, for as the news of Harcourt's death spread through the village, it seemed that half its respectable inhabitants had cause, upon reflection, to be glad of it. I said as much to Holmes over our breakfast at the inn, and he agreed with a readiness that surprised me. A murder with one suspect is a simple exercise, Watson, fit only for the pages of a magazine. A murder with a dozen is a proper study for a reasoning man. We shall want them all, I think, before the day is out. Sir Adrian Mercer was the first to present himself, arriving at the inn in a state of controlled agitation, entirely unlike the easy authority I had been given to expect of a county magistrate. He was a heavy, handsome man of middle years, with the high colour of one much out of doors, and he came, he informed us, not from any obligation, but from a wish to be perfectly open regarding his own dealings with the dead man. "I saw Harcourt yesterday afternoon," said he, seating himself with evident reluctance. "He had got hold of some old deed. I do not know how. The fellow had a positive genius for unearthing what other men had buried, which he claimed showed that my father, in acquiring the greater part of our present estate, had knowingly turned a tenant family from land that was rightfully theirs. Whether the thing was true I cannot say with certainty, for my father died before I came into my inheritance, and such matters were not spoken of in our house. but Harcourt made it very plain that its publication would end any hope I might entertain of advancement upon the bench. And you resented this, said Holmes. I will not pretend otherwise, Mr. Holmes, but I did not kill him for it. I am a magistrate, sir, not a murderer, whatever temptation the distinction may occasionally present. He had scarcely gone before Mrs. Clara Bellamy arrived, composed and quiet in her widow's black, though I observed a certain hardness about the mouth that spoke of long-suppressed grievance now, perhaps, permitted at last to surface. She told us without visible emotion that Harcourt had informed her, not 3 days since, of his intention to dismiss her from his service at the quarter's end, without pension or character, after 22 years of faithful attendance upon his affairs. I knew where he kept his private papers, Mr. Holmes, if that is your next question. I kept them myself for the most part, sorted and filed as he required. I will not tell you I am sorry he is dead. I will only tell you I did not kill him. Caleb Rudge came next, a small, precise, anxious man, his hands perpetually occupied in some nervous motion of the fingers, as though counting invisible coins. He confessed with evident shame that Harcourt had on several occasions paid him a small sum for the privilege of examining the parish registers after the hours at which the vestry was properly locked. I never touched the books myself, sir, beyond fetching them down and locking them away again. I want that understood. Whatever alteration was made, I had no hand in it, though I own I fear I shall be blamed for negligence, if for nothing worse. Reverend Vale, when we returned to the rectory that afternoon, received us with a countenance so drawn and grey that I felt a physician's concern for him quite apart from the demands of the case. He admitted, without our asking, that he had gone to Harcourt only the day before to beg him privately to abandon whatever evidence he held touching the Wycliffe marriage. I told him that an innocent family's peace was worth more than the strict letter of an old record, whatever it might show. He laughed at me, Mr. Holmes. He said I preferred my own comfort to the truth, and that a clergyman who valued comfort above truth was a poor sort of clergyman indeed. I have not been able to put the words from my mind since. It was toward evening, when we had nearly exhausted the list Vale had given us, that Holmes received intelligence. I never learned by what channel, though I suspected the landlord's boy, who seemed to serve my friend as an unpaid intelligence department throughout our stay, that Dr. Matthew Wycliffe, Eleanor's younger brother, had been observed near the church on the previous evening, though he was known to hold a post in a London hospital, and had given no notice of any visit to Belminster. When taxed with this, the young man, summoned to the rectory in some confusion, admitted the truth with a frankness that did him credit. I came down on the last train unknown to Eleanor, meaning only to see Harcourt myself and persuade him, by whatever means I could, to abandon his threat against my mother. I did see him, briefly, but he would not be moved, and I left the church grounds before 9, I give you my word, without having laid a hand upon him. When at last we sat alone that evening beside the inn fire, I confessed to Holmes that I found myself thoroughly confounded by the wealth of motive now before us. Everyone we have spoken to, Holmes, had cause enough to wish the man dead, and not one of them, so far as I can see, has told us an outright lie. That is precisely what troubles me, said Holmes, drawing his knees up and regarding the fire with narrowed eyes. An impulsive murderer, Watson, conceals his evidence badly, in the panic of the moment. A dropped weapon, a hasty flight, a story that will not bear a second telling. But a calculating murderer arranges his evidence clearly, as a man arranges furniture for a photograph, so that the eye may fall precisely where he wishes it to fall. Consider our vestry of last night, the cloak button conveniently torn, the note conveniently clenched, the window conveniently open, with earth prepared beneath it, as though for the express purpose of receiving a footprint that was never actually made. It is too eloquent a scene, my friend. Real crime stammers. This one recites. He drew from his pocket-book, then, a small curl of blue-grey paper, scarcely larger than a shilling, which he had discovered, he said, in the vestry wastebasket during our examination of the previous night, and upon which the faint tracing of a watermark could just be made out against the lamplight. And there is this also, he said, which I have not yet had occasion to explain to you, and which I think may prove, before we are done, rather more instructive than the button, the note, or the earth combined. I asked him what he made of it, but he only shook his head and returned it to his pocket-book, remarking that a fragment was a poor foundation for a theory, and that he would rather gather its fellows before building upon it. Chapter 5. The Weight of Conscience. Holmes did not, as I had half expected, begin the next day's work with any fresh accusation. Rather, he proposed to me, over a breakfast eaten in unusual silence, that we should speak once more to each of the persons we had already examined, but upon a different footing altogether. I have asked them what they did, Watson, and what they saw. I have not yet asked them what they fear. There is more truth to be got from a man's dread than from his account of his movements, for movements may be rehearsed, but fear betrays itself even in the choosing of silence. We found Eleanor Wycliffe at the schoolhouse, dismissing her last pupils for the day, and she received us with a composure that had, I thought, grown a shade more brittle since the previous evening. Holmes asked her, without preamble, what disgrace would mean to her, should the whole unhappy history of her mother's marriage become public. She considered the question with a gravity that did not surprise me, for I had already begun to think her a woman of unusual depth. "I could bear it myself, Mr. Holmes," she said at last. "I have borne a good deal in my life already, and I dare say I could learn to bear the stares of the village, and the whispers, and whatever else such a disclosure might bring upon me. But my mother is not strong, sir. She has believed herself a respectable wife these 40 years, and I do not think her heart could sustain the discovery, should it prove true, that her whole life has rested upon a fiction." Her voice caught very slightly upon the last word, and she looked away toward the window. "It is her I think of, not myself." Holmes thanked her gently, and we went on our way, and I noticed that he walked some distance in silence before remarking that her distress had centred, throughout, upon her mother's peace of mind, and not once, in all she had said, upon any fear for her own safety or reputation before the law. A guilty woman defending herself thinks first of her own danger, Watson. An innocent woman thinks first of the person she loves. It is not proof, but it is evidence, and I set some store by it. Matthew Wycliffe we found at the rectory, having remained in Belminster against his own professional interest to stand by his sister in her trouble. He spoke with a young man's heat of the wrong Harcourt had attempted against his family, and declared, more than once, that he would surrender his hospital appointment without a second thought, rather than see Eleanor sacrifice the small property her father had left her. "Let him take back his miserable evidence and be damned to it," said he, with more feeling than caution. "I would rather my sister owned nothing than owned it at such a price." Yet when Holmes pressed him, gently, upon the precise wording of the altered entry, whether the false name substituted for the true bridegroom had struck him, upon examination, as a common or an unusual one, the young doctor confessed, with some surprise at his own ignorance, that he had never troubled to look closely at the register itself, and could not, in truth, have told us what name now stood where the original had been. "That is curious in a man so passionately concerned," Holmes observed to me afterward, "though not, I grant you, inexplicable. Anger does not always trouble itself with particulars. Sir Adrian Mercer, when we called upon him at his own house that afternoon, spoke at considerable length, and with evident sincerity upon the general subject of justice, upon the duty owed by every honest man to see the truth prevail whatever the cost. Yet Holmes, listening with an air of polite attention that I had learned to recognise as his most dangerous mood, asked him presently whether he believed every lawful truth ought always, without exception, to be published to the world, whatever ruin it might work upon the innocent along with the guilty. Sir Adrian's fine flow of rhetoric checked itself abruptly, and he answered after a pause that there were, he supposed, degrees and circumstances to be considered in all things, an answer so markedly at variance with his earlier certainty that I saw Holmes's mouth twitch with something very near amusement. His fear, Watson, is not for justice at all, but for his own position upon the bench, and for the good opinion of his county. A man defending an abstract principle does not grow evasive when it is applied to himself. Mrs. Bellamy we found at Belminster Lodge, engaged, to my considerable surprise, in setting the dead man's papers in order upon his own desk, though no one had asked this service of her, and she stood, by her own account, to gain nothing by it. "Habit, I suppose," said she when Holmes remarked upon it. "I have kept his papers straight for 22 years, and I find I cannot leave them scattered now, though he will never thank me for it again." She spoke without visible grief, and yet her hands as she spoke continued their careful work of ordering, and I understood, better than any protestation could have taught me, that her loyalty, however ill-rewarded, had outlived her resentment. It was in the course of these interviews that Holmes turned the conversation, in each case, to certain small habits of the dead man, his manner of dress, his particular aversions, the trivial customs by which every man distinguishes himself from his fellows without knowing that he does so. From these scattered answers, patiently gathered, a curious composite emerged. Harcourt, it seemed, had never in cold weather removed the glove upon his right hand, on account of an old injury sustained, Mrs. Bellamy believed, in a riding accident many years before. He had never, so far as any could recall, used scented soap of any description, holding, as Mrs. Bellamy phrased it with a certain dry humour, that a land agent had no business smelling of a lady's dressing-table. And he had, by long and careful habit, carried the vestry key not loose in his pocket, but upon a chain worn inside his waistcoat, precisely, he had once told Rudge, so that it could never be lost or stolen from him. "And yet," said Holmes to me that evening as we sat once more beside our fire, "the key we found lying openly upon the vestry floor, some little distance from the body, as though dropped there by a careless hand rather than drawn forth from beneath a waistcoat by its rightful owner. Someone handled that key after Harcourt was already beyond the power of carrying it, Watson, and someone, I think, handled a good deal else besides, and then took the trouble of washing his hands before he arranged the remainder of the scene to his liking. I asked him what he made, then, of the lavender scent upon the glove, which had seemed to me from the first the plainest thread we possessed. I make a good deal less of it than Lestrade will, when he learns what I learned only this afternoon, that Eleanor Wycliffe herself uses no scented soap of any kind, but a plain, unperfumed article, purchased expressly because lavender irritates her mother's breathing and cannot be brought into the house. The clue that seemed to point most directly at her, "My dear Watson," has this evening turned its face the other way entirely. Chapter 6. The Loyalty of the Living. It is a curious feature of criminal investigation, as I have had frequent occasion to observe in the course of my long association with Sherlock Holmes, that a case does not always advance by the addition of new facts, but quite as often by the patient rearrangement of facts already possessed. So it proved on the morning that followed our conversations touching the private fears of Belminster's several suspects, when Holmes announced his intention of reconstructing, hour by hour, the whole of the previous evening's movements about the church. "We have their motives, Watson, in some abundance, and we have begun to glimpse their fears. What we lack is their positions upon the board, each at the moment the game was lost. Let us go and ask not what they felt, but where they stood. By careful and patient inquiry, for country people, I observed, will speak more freely of their neighbours' comings and goings than of their own, Holmes assembled, piece by piece, a chronicle of that fatal evening which I set down here as he himself finally arranged it. Eleanor Wycliffe had gone to Harcourt at 7:30, remaining perhaps 20 minutes, and had left him, by her own unshaken account, alive and angry, though angry, as she insisted, at his obstinacy rather than at any despair of her own. Matthew Wycliffe had arrived shortly afterward, unknown even to his sister, and had likewise departed before the half-hour was out. Having concealed his visit, he now confessed with some shame, chiefly to spare Eleanor the burden of a second suspicion falling upon their family. Reverend Vale, it transpired upon closer questioning, had entered the church itself at 8:15, for what he described as private prayer before the evening's business, though he had at first denied the visit altogether, and admitted it now only with evident reluctance, and a hint that he had overheard something during those minutes which he did not care to repeat. Mrs. Bellamy, for her part, had come to the vestry a little before 8:30, bringing certain papers her employer had that afternoon required, and had found him alive and occupied, engaged, she believed, in writing some letter or memorandum at his desk. Caleb Rudge, whose duty it was to see the church secured for the night, had locked the great west door at 20 minutes to 9, though he admitted, when pressed, that the small side door giving upon the vestry garden could always be opened from within by anyone still inside, a circumstance he had not thought worth mentioning until Holmes drew it from him. "You perceive the pattern, Watson," said Holmes, as we walked back toward the inn through a fine grey drizzle that seemed scarcely to have ceased since the night of the murder. "Every one of them has withheld something. The rector concealed his prayer. The young doctor concealed his journey. Eleanor concealed, I think, rather more of her interview with Harcourt than she has yet told us. And yet observe this curious feature of their several silences. Not one of these concealments serves the person who practices it. Vale gains nothing by hiding an hour of prayer. Matthew gains nothing by hiding a visit he has since freely confessed. Each lie, examined closely, is told not to shield the speaker, but to shield some other person the speaker loves or honours. We are dealing, my friend, not with a conspiracy of guilt, but with an accumulation of loyalty, and the two, though they may wear a similar face to a hasty observer, are very different creatures indeed. It was that same afternoon that Lestrade, acting upon a warrant obtained without much difficulty from the local bench, conducted a thorough search of Harcourt's office at the lodge, in which Holmes and I were permitted by virtue of our earlier involvement to take some part. Among the dead man's papers we found, sealed and evidently prepared for imminent dispatch, 3 letters of a character that left little doubt as to the general nature of his business. One, addressed to Sir Adrian Mercer, threatened the publication of certain particulars respecting the acquisition of the Mercer estate unless a sum was forthcoming within the fortnight. A second, unaddressed but plainly intended for Eleanor Wycliffe, renewed in the coldest possible terms his demand for the transfer of her father's property. A third, more alarming still, was addressed to the editor of a London newspaper of no very scrupulous reputation, offering, for a stated consideration, the full particulars of what Harcourt termed, with a callousness that turned my stomach, a pretty little history of bigamy in a respectable Surrey family. It was among these same papers that Holmes came upon a pad of blue-grey legal notepaper, from which, he observed at once, a single sheet had been torn close to the binding, leaving a ragged edge that matched, when he laid it beside his pocket-book, the small curled fragment he had earlier recovered from the vestry wastebasket. "Our fragment has found its family, Watson," said he, with quiet satisfaction, and set the 2 pieces together to confirm beyond any reasonable doubt that they had once formed a single sheet. But it was upon a sheet of blotting paper, taken from beneath Harcourt's own hand, that Holmes made the discovery which was, I think, to alter the whole complexion of the case. Holding it to a mirror, as is his custom with such evidence, he traced out, letter by patient letter, the faint reversed impression of a sentence that had evidently been blotted before the ink was fully dry, and which read, when at last fully deciphered, "Eleanor knows the truth is kinder than the record." I confess I stared at this transcription for some moments, before its significance broke upon me. "The note in his hand," I said slowly, "read only, 'Eleanor knows the truth.' But this is a different sentence altogether." "It is the same sentence, Watson, robbed of its conclusion," said Holmes, and there was in his voice a note I had not heard before in the whole course of our inquiry, something graver than mere satisfaction at a puzzle's advancing solution. Harcourt did not write an accusation against Eleanor Wycliffe. He wrote, I believe, a private and rather bitter reflection upon his own conduct, that the girl's simple faith in a kinder truth than his own cold record represented was, in its way, a truer thing than all his 30 years of patient documentation. Someone tore away the final words, Watson, and left only the fragment most calculated to appear an accusation, to be found clenched in a dead man's hand by whoever should discover him first. Then the note was deliberately falsified. Deliberately, and with no small ingenuity. Our murderer did not invent evidence from nothing, which is a clumsy and dangerous business at the best of times. He took what already existed, and by the simple expedient of removing what did not suit his purpose, transformed a fragment of private conscience into an instrument of accusation. It is, I confess, rather a clever piece of work, and cleverness of that particular stamp narrows our field of suspects considerably, for it was not done by a man in panic, nor by a woman fleeing in the dark through a window prepared beforehand with borrowed earth. It was done, Watson, by someone with time and calm and a very exact understanding of how a single sentence might be made to convict an innocent woman of a crime she did not commit. Chapter 7. The Confession of Caleb Rudge. The blow, when it fell from a quarter I confess I had not anticipated. We had returned to the rectory upon the following morning, Holmes intending, I believe, to press Reverend Vale further upon the subject of the overheard conversation he had so reluctantly admitted to the day before, when we found the household already in a state of considerable agitation. Caleb Rudge, it seemed, had presented himself at first light, and had asked, in a voice scarcely above a whisper, to be taken before Inspector Lestrade, that he might make a full confession of his guilt. We found the little clerk seated in the rectory's small parlour, his hands for once perfectly still upon his knees, his face grey with the particular exhaustion of a man who has at last set down a burden too heavy to carry farther. Lestrade, summoned in haste, arrived within the half-hour, and I confess that even I, who had by then some considerable practice in doubting first appearances, found the clerk's account, as it unfolded, disturbingly persuasive. "It was I who altered the register, sir," said Rudge, addressing himself chiefly to Lestrade, though his eyes strayed more than once, and with a kind of pleading, toward the Reverend Vale, who sat by the window with a countenance of the deepest distress. "Mrs. Wycliffe came to me years ago, it must be 15 years or more, and begged me with tears to set right an error she said had crept into the record of her marriage. Her husband's name, she told me, had been wrongly entered by the clerk of that day, through some confusion with another family of similar name, and she feared the mistake might one day cast a shadow upon her children's inheritance. I loved that family, sir, as I love few others in this parish, and I did what she asked, God forgive me, thinking only to spare her a trouble that seemed to me no more than a clerical slip requiring a clerical remedy." "And Harcourt," Lestrade prompted, his pencil moving steadily. "Harcourt discovered it, sir, some months since, I do not know how. The man had an uncanny nose for such things, and came to me privately, threatening exposure unless I held my tongue regarding certain other small matters between us. On the night in question, I went to the vestry to plead with him, as others had pleaded that he let the old matter rest. He would not. We quarrelled. I do not clearly remember striking him, sir, but I must have done, for I remember the cross in my hand, and I remember his stillness afterward, and very little else with any clearness at all." He went on in a low and halting voice to describe the remaining particulars of that night with what appeared, upon a first hearing, to be perfect and damning accuracy. The position in which the body had fallen, the open cupboard, the button he claimed to have torn deliberately from Eleanor's cloak, retrieved earlier that same day, in order to divert suspicion toward a young woman he believed, mistakenly, to be beyond real danger from the law. The note he said he had torn and placed in the dead man's hand. Lestrade, listening, wore the satisfied expression of a man who sees a troublesome case closing itself before his eyes, and Reverend Vale, white and trembling, murmured something about mercy and the frailty of an old and faithful servant driven to desperation. Even I, walking back toward the inn beside Holmes in the pale morning light, found myself half persuaded that our inquiry had reached its natural conclusion. "It is a complete confession, Holmes," I ventured. "It accounts for everything. The alteration, the motive, the staged scene, even the earth beneath the window, which I suppose he might have carried in himself, in his agitation, without troubling to consider how it would appear." "It is a very complete confession," said Holmes, and something in the flatness of his tone arrested me at once. "Too complete, Watson, by a considerable margin, and completeness of that particular polish is, in my experience, rather more often the mark of instruction than of memory." I asked him what he meant, and he stopped upon the road, turning to face me with the earnestness he reserved for moments when he wished a point driven fully home. "Consider the manner of his account, Watson, not merely its substance. He described to us the position of the body, the state of the cupboard, the button, the note, every object, in short, that any careful observer might have noted from without, or have had described to him by another. But he could not tell us, when I asked him privately not an hour ago, whether Harcourt's eyes had been open or closed as he lay dying. A man who has truly struck another down in the heat of quarrel does not forget such a thing, Watson, however he may wish to. It burns itself into the memory more surely than any inventory of objects. And he told us, moreover, that the brass cross felt cold in his hand when first he seized it. Yet the cross had stood, as I satisfied myself upon our very first visit to that vestry, in a patch of afternoon sun falling through the south window for a full hour before the light failed, and would have retained its warmth long past 9 o'clock. He knows the furniture of the scene, Watson, as a man knows a stage that has been carefully set for him. He does not know its sensations as a man knows what he has truly lived through. But how could he know so much if he did not do the thing himself? That, said Holmes, resuming our walk with a quickened step, is the very question that troubles me most. There is one detail, however, which troubles me a good deal more than any other, and which I have saved until now, because I wished to be certain of it before I spoke. Rudge told Lestrade that he opened the register cupboard, after the deed was done, with Harcourt's own key drawn from the dead man's pocket, But that cupboard's lock, Watson, has a peculiar fault. I satisfied myself of it during our very first examination, by which the door will not open at all unless it is first lifted slightly upon its hinges before the key is turned. It is a small thing, a mere trick of an old and ill-fitted lock, and it is known, I should think, only to those who use that cupboard regularly in the ordinary course of their duties. Rudge did not mention it. He did not lift the door, and yet he claims to have opened it, in darkness, in haste, upon the very first attempt. I confess the full weight of this did not strike me at once, but Holmes's next words left no room for misunderstanding. Rudge's account, Watson, has the smooth and dutiful quality of a lesson well learned rather than a memory truly possessed. He knows what he was told to know, and no more. Someone has supplied him with the furniture of this confession, piece by careful piece, and has left him ignorant only of those small, unteachable sensations that no instruction, however patient, can ever quite convey. I believe, my friend, that Caleb Rudge is guilty of nothing more than devotion so complete that he is prepared to hang for a crime he did not commit, in order to shield the person he believes committed it in his stead. Chapter 8. The Grain of Wax. Holmes said little more upon the subject that morning, but I observed, as I had observed so many times before in the course of our long friendship, that a certain restless energy had come upon him, the outward sign of a mind that has ceased merely to gather and begun at last to build. He announced, shortly after our midday meal, that he intended to return alone to the vestry, and though I offered to accompany him, he asked with unusual gentleness that I permit him an hour or two of solitary examination. There are moments, Watson, when even the most sympathetic companion is one observer too many. I promise you a full account before the day is done. He returned to the inn as the light was beginning to fail, his boots muddied to the ankle, and his expression that of a man who has at last laid hold of something long sought, and found it, upon close inspection, heavier than he had anticipated. "I have been examining wax, Watson," said he, drawing off his coat and seating himself before our fire with the particular deliberateness he reserved for the recounting of some significant discovery. "You will recall the smear I noted in the scratch upon Harcourt's desk on the night we found him dead. I confess I assumed, as I dare say you did also, that it had come from his own seal, which we saw him use with our own eyes not 2 days before, and which he pressed twice upon the paper on account of its chipped edge. I had assumed exactly that, I admitted. So had I assumed it until this afternoon when I obtained from Mrs. Bellamy a stick of Harcourt's own sealing wax and compared it, under my lens, with the fragment recovered from the desk. Harcourt's wax, Watson, contains a fine metallic powder, mixed in by the maker to give it a certain dull shimmer when pressed, a costly and rather ostentatious sort of wax such as a vain man might choose for his private correspondence. The wax in the scratch upon the desk contains no such powder whatever. It is softer to the touch, more fragrant, and mingled, unless I am much mistaken, with pine resin rather than the ordinary shellac of commerce. It is not letter-sealing wax at all, Watson. It is the coarser, cheaper wax used by parish clerks the country over to secure the cords about old bundles of documents. The very sort of wax, in fact, that I found not an hour ago in a drawer of Reverend Vale's own study. I sat forward at this, for I began, though dimly, to perceive the direction of his thought. "You believe someone brought that wax into the vestry deliberately, to suggest Harcourt's presence at the desk after some other person had already left it?" "I believe the murderer wished the scene to speak of Harcourt's own habits, Watson, and reached, in the haste of the moment, for wax he associated with sealing and documents generally, without pausing to consider that a man so particular in his habits as Harcourt would never have mixed his costly private seal with the common wax of the vestry cupboard. It is a small error, but it is precisely the sort of error that a careful and calculating mind, working swiftly and under strain, is most liable to commit, the error not of ignorance, but of assumption." He went on to describe a further discovery, made in the course of that same solitary examination, which I confess struck me even more forcibly than the matter of the wax. Turning the brass processional cross once more beneath his lens, he had found, caught in a small crevice at its base, where the shaft met the ornamented foot, a minute trace of white wool fibre, scarcely visible to the unassisted eye. Reverend Vale, as you will have observed, Watson, wears black throughout, in the manner proper to his calling. But I recalled, from our very first visit to the rectory, a pair of winter gloves lying upon the hall table, black upon the outer surface, but lined, as I satisfied myself this afternoon, by the simple expedient of turning one inside out, while the good Reverend was occupied elsewhere with a soft white wool. I own that I felt at this a chill quite different from any I had experienced in the vestry itself, for I had by now formed a genuine regard for the old clergyman, and found the implication of Holmes's discovery difficult to receive. "There is one matter more," Holmes continued, "which I think will complete the circle, unwelcome as I confess I find its completion. You will recall the mud beneath the open window, which I remarked upon the very night of the murder as having been damp only upon its surface, though the rain had scarcely begun to fall. I have this afternoon examined that mud with some care, and find it mingled with fragments of crushed lavender leaf, of a variety that grows, in some abundance, along the southern border of the rectory garden, not 40 yards from where we now sit. The lavender, I said slowly. Harcourt's glove. Precisely, Watson. The scent that seemed, upon first discovery, to point so directly toward Eleanor Wycliffe, points in truth toward whoever carried, upon their own hands or clothing, the crushed leaves of that particular garden, and who afterward, in arranging the dead man's hand about the torn fragment of his own private reflection, transferred that same scent to Harcourt's glove. Someone gathered mud and lavender from the rectory garden itself, brought them into the vestry prepared and ready, scattered them beneath the window to suggest an intruder's hasty flight, and only then turned to the grim business of arranging the remainder of the scene, the cross, the wax, the note, the button borrowed, I now believe quite genuinely from Eleanor's cloak, though not upon the night of the murder itself, but at some earlier hour, and for a purpose she herself never suspected. He rose then, and stood for a long moment gazing into the fire with an expression I had rarely seen upon his features, not the keen, almost predatory satisfaction that generally attended the closing of a case, but something graver, nearer to sorrow. Lestrade is even now preparing, I have no doubt, to act upon Rudge's confession, and to close this matter in the manner most convenient to a busy department. I must go to him tonight, Watson, and I must tell him what the wax and the wool and the lavender have told me. Reverend Vale killed Lionel Harcourt. Of that I now entertain no serious doubt whatever. He paused, and something in his stillness told me the sentence was not yet complete. But logical certainty, Watson, is not the whole of this matter, and I confess that I have rarely approached a conclusion with less appetite for the arrest that must follow it. I shall ask everyone concerned to gather at the rectory tomorrow evening, that the full truth, whatever comfort or discomfort it may bring, may at last be spoken openly, rather than left to fester in 100 private and partial silences. Chapter 9. The Two Entries. The rectory drawing-room, when we assembled there upon the following evening, wore an aspect very different from the comfortable, book-lined chamber in which Reverend Vale had first received us. A fire burned upon the hearth, and chairs had been arranged in a rough half-circle at Holmes's own direction, but the warmth of the room did little, I thought, to dispel the chill that seemed to have settled upon its occupants. Eleanor Wycliffe sat beside her brother, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Sir Adrian Mercer stood near the window, with the stiff discomfort of a man unaccustomed to attending rather than presiding. Mrs. Bellamy occupied a chair a little apart from the others, composed as ever, and Caleb Rudge, released upon Holmes's own representation from the custody in which Lestrade had, with some reluctance, placed him, sat with his eyes fixed upon the carpet, as though he could not yet believe himself present at all. Lestrade himself stood near the door, notebook in hand, his expression that of a man prepared to be persuaded, though not without a struggle. Reverend Vale sat a little apart from the rest, in the deep chair beside his own hearth, and I confess that as I looked upon his lined and gentle countenance, I found myself hoping, with an intensity that surprised me, that Holmes's chain of reasoning might yet prove mistaken. It did not. "I will not prolong what must, for one person in this room, be a very great ordeal," Holmes began, standing before the fire with his hands clasped loosely behind him. The register was altered, and Lionel Harcourt was killed by two acts which appear, at first consideration, entirely distinct, and which are, in truth, most intimately connected. I will tell you the whole history, as I have now pieced it together, and I will ask that no one interrupt me until I have done. He turned first to the matter of the register itself. In the year 1872, he explained, Agnes Bell had entered into a private marriage with Jonathan Wycliffe, believing herself free to do so. Her first husband, a man who had deserted her some years before, under circumstances she had long preferred not to revisit, having been reported dead upon evidence that seemed, at the time, entirely sufficient. Years later, however, it emerged, through some channel Harcourt alone had troubled to trace, that this first husband had in fact survived the second ceremony by several months, rendering the marriage to Wycliffe, strictly speaking, void from its inception. But there is a second fact which Harcourt discovered and suppressed, and which is the true key to this whole unhappy business, Holmes continued. Upon the confirmed death of her first husband, some months after her marriage to Wycliffe, Agnes and Jonathan were quietly remarried, in perfect propriety, the ceremony being entered, through some oversight of the clerk then serving, not in the bound register itself, but upon a loose parish sheet that was never afterward properly gathered into its proper volume. That lawful second marriage, gentlemen, was entirely valid in the eyes of both God and the law. But Harcourt found both records, the earlier, technically void ceremony, and the later, entirely lawful one, and he made his choice between them according to his own interest rather than the truth. He removed the sheet recording the lawful marriage, and altered the entry recording the earlier invalid one, so that only doubt and scandal should remain where certainty had in fact existed all along. A murmur ran about the room at this, and I saw Eleanor's hand fly to her mouth, though whether in relief or in fresh distress I could not at once tell. It was Harcourt, then, who altered the register, said Lestrade, frowning. It was Harcourt, Inspector, employing skills honed over 30 years of genealogical practice, and employing also, I think we may fairly say, the willing but innocent assistance of Caleb Rudge, who permitted him access to the register after hours, believing him engaged in some legitimate inquiry, and who has spent these past days shielding, from motives of the deepest loyalty, not his own guilt, but the guilt of a man he loves far better than himself. Reverend Vale had not moved throughout this recital, but I saw his hands, folded in his lap, tighten upon one another until the knuckles whitened. Eleanor Wycliffe, Holmes went on more gently, had learned something of this history from her mother, though not, I think, the whole of it, and certainly not the existence of the suppressed lawful marriage. She believed, as did we all until this evening, that public exposure could bring only ruin upon her family, and it was this fear, and no other, that took her to Harcourt's vestry meeting on the night of his death, and that has coloured every silence and every evasion we have encountered since. He turned at last, and though his voice did not rise, I felt the whole room grow very still. Reverend Vale confronted Lionel Harcourt in that vestry at 9 o'clock, demanding the return of the missing sheet, whose existence he had, I believe, only lately come to suspect through his own long familiarity with those old records. Harcourt refused, and declared his intention, in the plainest terms, to sell the scandal to whatever purchaser would pay him best for it. In the course of that argument, by every account I have been able to gather of his character, Harcourt permitted himself the cruelty of mocking not only the Reverend's faith, but Agnes Wycliffe's frailty, and Eleanor's devotion besides. It was then, and only then, that Septimus Vale seized the cross that has stood upon that altar for 200 years and struck the blow that ended Lionel Harcourt's life. The Reverend spoke for the first time, his voice very low. It was not premeditated, Mr. Holmes. I swear to you before God, it was not premeditated. I believe you, said Holmes, with a gentleness that surprised me, given the gravity of what he must next say. The blow itself, I have no doubt, was the act of a single terrible moment, provoked beyond what any man, however patient, could easily have borne. But everything that followed, sir, was deliberate, and it is that deliberation which I cannot pass over in silence, however much I may sympathise with the impulse that produced it. You took the button from Eleanor's own cloak, which had come into your possession, I imagine, through some perfectly innocent circumstance, and you placed it beside the body. You gathered mud and crushed lavender from your own garden, and scattered it beneath the window to suggest a flight that never occurred. You tore away the kinder half of a sentence Harcourt himself had written, leaving only the fragment most damning to an innocent woman. And when suspicion had settled upon her regardless, you turned, in your desperation, to Caleb Rudge, and persuaded that faithful and frightened man that only his sacrifice could yet save the Wycliffes from ruin. Vale bowed his head, and I saw, though he made no sound, that he was weeping. "You acted, sir, to protect people you love from a cruel and calculating man," said Holmes, "and I will not pretend that I regard your original impulse without sympathy. But mercy, however genuine, cannot rewrite the authorship of a deed, nor can it justify the transfer of guilt onto the innocent shoulders of a young woman, or the willing shoulders of an old and faithful servant. You have done a wrong in seeking to prevent a wrong, and both truths, I think, must now be spoken together, and neither permitted to silence the other." "I know it," said Vale very quietly. "I have known it since the moment the cross left my hand. I am ready, Inspector, to go with you now." Chapter 10. The Law and the Record. The missing sheet was found the following morning in a concealed compartment of Harcourt's document cabinet that Holmes discovered by the simple expedient of measuring the cabinet's outer dimensions against its several inner drawers and observing a discrepancy of some 3 inches that no honest joiner would have left unaccounted for. It proved, upon examination, exactly what Holmes had predicted: a single leaf of old parish paper, recording, in a clerk's careful hand now some 30 years faded, the lawful second marriage of Agnes Bell and Jonathan Wycliffe, entirely regular in every particular. The sheet was restored, under the supervision of the diocesan authorities, and with Sir Adrian Mercer's assistance in his magisterial capacity, to its proper place among the parish records, and the legitimacy of Mrs. Wycliffe's marriage and of her children's birth was established beyond any further shadow of question. Caleb Rudge was spared the prosecution he had so readily invited upon himself, Holmes taking some pains to demonstrate before the appropriate authorities that his confession, however sincerely offered, had been made under an emotional pressure that rendered it unreliable as evidence, and that he had, moreover, sought to withdraw it of his own accord before any formal charge could be laid against him. The old clerk returned to his duties at St. Anselm's a chastened man, but not, I am glad to record, a ruined one. Sir Adrian Mercer, whom I had privately judged upon our first meeting to be a man more concerned with the preservation of his own position than with any nicer question of justice, surprised me not a little in the weeks that followed by arranging entirely upon his own initiative a settlement of restitution for the tenant family his father had, by Harcourt's account, wrongfully displaced a generation before. He told Holmes, upon the single occasion we saw him again before our departure, that he had come to prefer a voluntary reckoning with an old wrong to the perpetual fear of some future exposure, whatever inconvenience the reckoning might cost him. Mrs. Bellamy, for her part, delivered to Lestrade the whole of Harcourt's private files, including the several instruments of quiet blackmail by which he had for years secured his comfortable position among the county families of Surrey. A number of persons whose names I shall not set down here, having no wish to revive griefs that Holmes's discretion has already permitted to subside, found themselves thereby able to recover documents and reputations they had long believed permanently at another man's mercy. Reverend Vale was arrested, as he had himself foretold, and stood his trial some months later at the Surrey Assizes. Holmes, called as a principal witness, gave an account of the case that omitted nothing material to the establishment of guilt, but that included also, with a care I thought did him the greatest credit, every circumstance that might reasonably weigh in the scale of mercy. The years of provocation the dead man had inflicted upon the parish generally, the immediate and extreme cruelty of his taunts on the night in question, and the old clergyman's full and unforced confession once the truth could no longer be honourably withheld. It was, I think, as fair a telling as any accused man could have hoped to receive from the very witness whose evidence had convicted him. I learned, some months afterward, through a brief note from Reverend Vale's own hand, that the sentence passed upon him had been, in the circumstances, a comparatively merciful one, and that he bore his punishment, whatever its precise term, with the same quiet dignity that had marked his whole conduct once the truth had at last been spoken. We returned to Baker Street upon a grey afternoon in late October, and I recall that some days passed before I found occasion to raise with Holmes a question that had troubled me, in one form or another, since the evening of Vale's arrest. We sat together beside our own familiar fire, Holmes occupied with his violin, drawing from it, as was his habit when deep in reflection, a low and wandering air that seemed to have no fixed melody, and I put to him at last the doubt that had lain upon my mind. Was justice truly served, Holmes, in this affair of Belminster? Harcourt corrupted the truth for 30 years, and profited handsomely by every corruption, and no law of England ever touched him for it. Vale, who acted, whatever his errors afterward, from something very near to love, must answer for a single moment's violence with the whole remaining weight of his life. Holmes set down his bow and was silent for a moment before he answered. You ask me whether the law is just, Watson, and I can only tell you that the law was never designed to answer so large a question. It is designed to answer a smaller one. Who did what, and to whom, and by what means, and it answers that question, when properly applied, with a fair degree of reliability. What it does with the answer once obtained is a separate matter, governed by considerations the law itself cannot fully weigh. Harcourt's crime was one the law, as presently constituted, scarcely recognises as a crime at all. A slow accumulation of small cruelties, each individually within the letter of what a land agent may lawfully do. Vale's crime was sudden, visible and fatal, and the law knows precisely how to name it, whatever sympathy may afterward be brought to bear upon its punishment. That seems a bleak philosophy for a man who has spent his life pursuing justice. Not justice, Watson, truth. I have never claimed to pursue the other, though I confess I am glad when the two arrive together, as they do not always trouble to do. Law cannot depend entirely upon sympathy, for sympathy shifts with every fresh observer, and a system of justice that bent itself to each new tale of provocation would soon protect no one at all. And yet reason without mercy, applied without regard to the particular soul before it, becomes in the end another and colder form of cruelty, no less real for being lawful. I don't know that Belminster has resolved that tension, Watson. I am not sure it can be resolved. I know only that the facts, once properly established, allow whatever mercy the law is capable of extending to be extended honestly, rather than upon some comfortable fiction that might later unravel. I thought, as he spoke, of that old register lying in its locked cupboard at St. Anselm's, and of the 2 alterations it had in the end been made to bear. The one worked patiently in ink, across many quiet hours, to transform a family's private truth into an instrument of another man's profit. The other attempted, in a single moment of violence, to erase the consequences the first had set loose upon the world. Between them, I reflected, lay the whole sad history of the case, and perhaps a good deal more besides. Holmes had restored the record I wrote that night in the pages of my private journal, not by choosing finally between the claims of law and the claims of mercy, but by insisting before either claim could rightly be heard upon the plain and patient establishment of fact. Reason, I have come to believe, identifies the guilty. Law assigns to guilt its proper consequence. But it is mercy, tempering both without denying either, that determines in the final reckoning whether justice remains a thing fit for human hands to administer at all.